Hello and welcome. Finally, we're in the last module for this training series. Before we get into it, I'd like to mention that in this module we'll talk about the mantra rendering node. But before that, I'd like to promote some parameters for our glass geometry node. So when working with mantra, we have a lot of parameters that control how many samples we'd like to use. We can set limits for refraction, reflection, for diffuse, SSS if we're using anything volumetrics, isolating objects that we want to render. In this instance, I've just done one single frame render where everything's forced to exist inside that single render, but you could create passes. And we'll talk about different passes as well a little bit. We can add scripts, and the driver, of course, we're using Mantra in this training series. So the settings that we have, the rendering sample settings that we have, these are global settings. So everything is affected by these settings. So everything that exists in the object level will get the same settings. But for our purposes, I'd like to have higher settings for the glass for better renders. And one way to do that, by not just cranking up the settings for everything, is if we go into our edit rendering properties and we drop down into our mantra settings. Inside mantra, there's a sampling subfolder. Okay. Inside the sampling folder, there's parameters that we can export into this object level node. And here we have some of them. For example, pixel samples. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this inside our sampling subfolder, and we'll take a few of them just to get things going. We'll take the maximum number of indirect samples, min ray samples, max ray samples, noise level, global diffuse, reflection, refraction, sampling quality, and we'll throw all of those into our sampling folder here. Apply and accept. Now what that does for us is inside our object level node called class, in our sampling settings, we have all of these render sample parameters. Here, I'll put 9, 6 by 9, and crank up some of these settings. And this is awesome because we're controlling just these amounts for just this node. And when we go inside of our mantra, we could have, we'll turn on variance anti-aliasing. 6x6 is good. Min-max by default is good. We'll leave everything else as is. Up the transparency to 8, and we can also push this to, actually it would be a good idea if we push this into our geometry level node as well, so that we don't have to calculate this for everything. And limits 4x4 is fine. Diffuse limit 1, and you could change your tile size. You just will have just larger buckets doing the rendering, and change this back to use all processors. If you're using motion blur, you could turn on motion blur, but you'd have to have velocity going into your objects, and in the object level sampling section, don't forget to turn geometry velocity blur checkmark on. This needs to be on, otherwise the velocity blur will, the motion blur will not work, and you need to have the velocity attribute on your objects. If you don't have those and this check mark is on, it's still not going to work. But in this instance, everything's static, so we're not using this, and don't need this. So with all of that, you have your render node set up, and you have your object level node set up, and we could just hit render to disk or render time play, turning off override camera resolution, so we got full resolution, which is driven by our camera. So right now our camera is set to 720p. We could change this to whatever resolution that you're aiming to render towards. Also, if we go into the images tab, we can turn on extra images, and here you can create extra render passes. So for example, if you wanted to render depth map, if you just wanted to render the normals or direct lighting, if you had emissions, you could turn that on, or any of the extra images like reflections, refractions, and stuff like that. Awesome. So we're finally at the end. Thank you for the support, and if you have any questions, please do contact me, and we'll take it from there. Thanks again, and create something awesome. Bye.